What do you do when life changes faster than your heart can handle? Psalm 46 was not written only for peaceful days. It speaks to moments when the ground feels unstable, the future looks uncertain, and fear becomes louder than faith. Through cinematic storytelling, honest reflection, and the timeless message of Scripture, this script explores what it truly means to be still when everything around you seems out of control. This is not a call to ignore your problems. It is an invitation to discover the God who remains present when your world is shaking, and the quiet strength that begins when you stop trying to carry everything alone. What if the words, "Be still," were never meant for peaceful mornings? What if they were written for the hour when the phone rings too late? The doctor pauses before speaking. The money runs thin. And the future you carefully built begins to come apart in your hands. Most people imagine stillness as a quiet room, a candle burning beside an open Bible, sunlight resting across a wooden floor. But Psalm 46 does not begin in a quiet room. It begins with the earth giving way. It begins with mountains falling into the sea, waters roaring, and everything that once appeared permanent suddenly losing its shape. And perhaps that is why this ancient song still finds us. It does not speak to the version of life we post for others to see. It speaks to the life behind the closed door, when our confidence is gone and the heart asks a question it is almost afraid to say aloud. God, where are you when everything feels out of control? On a grey Monday morning in late October, Daniel Carter stood in the elevator of a glass office building and watched the numbers rise one floor at a time. He was 38 years old, though the faint lines around his eyes made him look older when he was tired. He wore the same navy jacket he had worn to every important meeting for 6 years, carried a leather bag with a broken zipper, and held a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Around him, other employees stared at their phones. No one spoke. The elevator hummed with the ordinary silence of people who believed they knew what the day would bring. Daniel believed he knew too. There would be emails, reports, a budget meeting at 10, a hurried sandwich at his desk, and traffic on the way home. He had complained about the sameness of his life more times than he could remember. That morning, he would have given anything to keep it. At 9:17, an invitation appeared on his calendar. Organizational update, conference room B. No explanation. 10 minutes later, Daniel sat beneath white ceiling panels with 12 other people from his department. The director avoided everyone's eyes. A human resources representative folded her hands on the table and began reading carefully prepared sentences about restructuring, market pressure, and positions being eliminated. Daniel heard the words, but could not make them belong to him. He looked at the pen in his hand. He noticed a small blue mark on his thumb. He watched the director's mouth move. Only when a folder was placed in front of him with his name printed on the first page did the room become real. After 11 years, his position was gone. He would receive 8 weeks of severance. His health coverage would continue through the end of the month. Someone would contact him about returning company equipment. The sentences were clean and professional. None of them contained the sound of his daughter laughing in the kitchen, the mortgage payment due in 12 days, or the medication his father could not afford without help. Daniel packed his desk into a cardboard box. A framed photograph of Claire and Emma went in first, then a coffee mug with a faded church logo, 3 notebooks, a phone charger, and the small wooden cross his grandmother had given him when he graduated from college. He had not noticed the cross in months. It had been hidden behind a stack of documents. Now it lay on top of everything, light enough to hold between 2 fingers, heavy enough to awaken the memory. His grandmother's house had smelled of cinnamon, laundry soap, and old books. When thunderstorms frightened him as a child, she never told him there was nothing to fear. She would sit beside him near the window and say, "Listen carefully, Danny. God is not only present after the storm, He is already present inside it." At 8 years old, Daniel imagined God standing somewhere in the rain, holding back the clouds with invisible hands. At 38, carrying his life through the lobby in a cardboard box. He did not know what those words could possibly mean. Outside, the city moved as though nothing had happened. Buses sighed at the curb. A cyclist shouted at a taxi. People hurried beneath umbrellas, while the first cold rain of the season darkened the pavement. Daniel placed the box in the back seat of his car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His phone vibrated with a message from Claire asking whether he could pick up milk. He stared at the screen. He wanted to tell her immediately. He also wanted 1 more hour in which he was still the husband who had a job, the father who knew how the bills would be paid, the man who could walk through the front door carrying answers instead of fear. So he typed, "Of course," and drove to the grocery store. That evening, he waited until Emma had gone to bed. She was 9 years old, curious about everything, and still believed adults could solve almost any problem if given enough time. Daniel found Claire at the kitchen table, sorting mail. A yellow lamp cast a warm circle over envelopes, school forms, and an unpaid repair estimate for the car. She looked up and smiled, but the smile faded when she saw his face. Daniel sat across from her. For a moment, he could not speak. He had rehearsed a sentence in the car, in the store, and while washing the dishes. Yet now the words seemed too large for the room. "They eliminated my position," he finally said. Claire did not answer at once. Her hand remained on an envelope. The clock above the stove ticked. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. "When?" she asked. "Today." Another pause. "How long do we have?" Daniel explained the severance, the insurance, and the applications he could begin sending in the morning. He spoke quickly, as though speed could make the plan feel stronger. Claire listened, nodded, and reached across the table. But when she touched his hand, something inside him almost broke. He pulled away gently and stood. "I'm okay," he said. It was the first lie fear taught him to tell. Before the week ended, the second call came. Daniel's mother phoned just after midnight. His father had collapsed in the hallway of their home and had been taken to the hospital. The doctors were still running tests. Daniel dressed in darkness, while Claire sat on the edge of the bed, tying back her hair. Rain tapped against the windows. Emma slept down the hall, unaware that the adults in her life were stepping into another uncertainty. At the hospital, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Daniel found his mother in a plastic chair beneath a television with the sound turned off. She looked smaller than he remembered. Her coat was buttoned incorrectly. When she saw him, she stood and whispered, "They won't tell me much yet." Daniel embraced her, then looked through the narrow glass panel in the door. His father lay beneath a thin blanket, surrounded by monitors. The man who had taught Daniel to ride a bicycle, change a tire, and keep his word, now appeared strangely still. Daniel felt the ground move again. The days that followed did not become a dramatic collapse. They became something quieter and, in some ways, more exhausting. Trouble arrived in small envelopes and unanswered calls. Daniel updated his resume, sent applications, and received automated messages thanking him for his interest. He drove his mother to the hospital. Electro-mother-owns, he spoke with insurance representatives. He calculated how long the savings might last if they cancelled the family vacation, delayed the car repair, stopped eating out, and used the emergency fund they had promised not to touch. At night, he lay beside Claire and listened to her breathing, wondering whether she was awake too. Their conversations became practical. Who would pick up Emma? Had the hospital called? Which bill could wait? Did the school need the permission form by Friday? They moved through the house like two people carrying full glasses of water, careful not to make one sudden movement. Daniel still believed in God. That was part of what made the silence so confusing. He had not abandoned faith. He had attended church, served on volunteer weekends, prayed before meals, and tried to live honorably. He did not believe these things made him immune to suffering, but somewhere beneath his theology was an unspoken expectation. If the worst came, God would at least feel near. Instead, prayer felt like speaking into a room after everyone had left. One morning, before sunrise, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his Bible open. The pages were thin and familiar. He found Psalm 46 because his grandmother had underlined it years ago. A faded line ran beneath the words, declaring God a refuge and strength, present in trouble. Daniel read them twice. Then he looked around the kitchen. Refrigerator hummed. A faucet dripped. The list of bills waited beneath a magnet. Present in trouble. The sentence sounded beautiful. It also felt almost impossible. He continued reading. The psalm did not describe minor inconvenience. It imagined the unthinkable, the earth changing, mountains shaking, waters roaring, nations in chaos. Daniel had read those images before as poetic exaggeration. Now, they seemed painfully accurate. A mountain is anything you thought would always remain where it was. A career, a marriage, a parent's strength, a child's sense of safety, a plan for the future. You do not realize how deeply you trusted the mountain until it begins to move. Daniel closed the Bible and pressed his palms against his eyes. He was not afraid of one thing. He was afraid of 10 things at once. He feared that his father would die. He feared that no one would hire him. He feared losing the house. He feared disappointing Claire. He feared Emma, discovering that her father was not as strong as she believed. Most of all, he feared that the shaking would reveal there had never been anything solid beneath him at all. There is a particular loneliness in being the person others expect to remain calm. Daniel's mother called him because he understood paperwork. Claire asked him what they should do because he had always made plans. Emma watched his face whenever adults used words she did not understand. Even his father, during a brief moment of clarity, gripped Daniel's wrist and said, "Take care of them." Daniel nodded. He did not say that he no longer knew how. He carried everyone's questions into the hospital restroom, locked the door, and stood over the sink while the fluorescent light flickered. He looked at himself in the mirror and whispered, "I can't do this." The words came out before he could stop them. He waited, almost expecting shame to follow. Instead, there was only the hum of the vent and the distant rolling of a cart through the corridor. That afternoon, a doctor explained that Daniel's father had suffered a serious cardiac event. He was stable for the moment, but recovery would be uncertain and slow. There would be procedures, medication changes, and decisions about care after discharge. Daniel listened carefully and asked the right questions. His mother held a tissue between trembling fingers. When the doctor left, she began to cry. Daniel put an arm around her and said, "We'll figure it out." The sentence had become his shield. "We'll figure it out." He said it to Claire about the bills, to Emma about school, to his mother about the hospital, and to himself about the future. But a shield can become heavy when you never set it down. By Friday evening, Daniel's shoulders ached. He had slept less than 12 hours in 4 days. His thoughts raced even when his body was still. On the drive home, traffic stopped beneath an overpass. Red brake lights stretched into the rain. Daniel's phone displayed 3 missed calls, 2 rejection emails, and a notice that the car payment would be withdrawn the next morning. He tightened his hands around the steering wheel. A horn sounded behind him. Another driver moved into his lane without signaling. Something small and ordinary snapped the thin thread of control he had been holding. Daniel shouted at the windshield. He struck the steering wheel once, then again. His breath became shallow. The inside of the car felt too narrow. He pulled onto the shoulder beneath the concrete shadow of the overpass and turned off the engine. For several minutes, he sat in darkness while vehicles passed beside him. Rain drummed on the roof so loudly it seemed to erase the world. Daniel leaned forward until his forehead touched the steering wheel. He tried to pray, but no polished words came, no verses, no calm gratitude. Only one sentence, broken and honest. "God, I don't know where you are." He said it again. "I don't know where you are." Then, because fear had already taken everything dignified from him, he added, "And I'm tired of pretending I do." Nothing miraculous happened. The rain did not stop. His phone did not ring with a job offer. A sudden warmth did not fill the car. For a while, there was only Daniel's breathing and the sound of water rushing along the road. Yet in that unremarkable moment, something shifted, not around him, but within the prayer itself. He had finally stopped explaining his life to God and started bringing his actual life to God. The difference was small, almost invisible. But honesty is often the first opening through which grace enters. Daniel did not feel peace. He felt exhausted. Still, exhaustion was more truthful than the strength he had been performing. When he reached home, Claire was sitting in the living room with the lights off. Emma had fallen asleep upstairs. Daniel removed his wet jacket and stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said. Claire looked toward him. Her face was tired, but not angry. "I was worried." Daniel nearly answered with another explanation about traffic. Instead, he sat beside her and said, "I'm scared." The words surprised both of them. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. "So am I." They did not solve anything that night. They did not create a perfect budget or speak with fearless confidence. They sat together in the dark and admitted that the future frightened them. For the first time all week, neither of them carried the fear alone. The next morning, Daniel drove back to the hospital before sunrise. The storm had passed, leaving the streets silver beneath a pale sky. He entered through the emergency doors and bought coffee from the machine that made everything taste faintly of plastic. His mother was asleep in the waiting room, her head tilted against the wall. Daniel placed his coat over her shoulders and walked toward the window at the end of the corridor. From the 6th floor, the city looked almost peaceful. Cars moved like small lights. Rooftops held shallow pools of rain. Somewhere below, thousands of people were waking to private battles no one else could see. Daniel took the wooden cross from his pocket. He had carried it since emptying his office. One edge was worn smooth where his grandmother's thumb had rubbed it during prayer. He remembered another evening from childhood, when thunder had shaken the windows of her house. She had not told him to stop being afraid. She had asked him to listen beneath the thunder. "There is the storm," she had said, "and then there is what remains when the storm has spent all its noise." At the time, he heard only rain. Now he wondered whether faith was not the ability to silence the storm, but the courage to believe that the storm was not the deepest reality in the room. Psalm 46 does something unexpected. It names chaos without surrendering to it. The earth may give way, but the psalm does not end there. The waters may roar, but they do not receive the final word. The nations may rage, but their noise is not ultimate. Again and again, the song turns the listener's attention away from the size of the crisis and toward the presence of God. Not a distant God observing from safety, a refuge, a strength, a help already found in the place of trouble. Daniel had always imagined refuge as somewhere you reached after escaping danger. But what if God was not only waiting beyond the danger? What if the refuge could be found while the hospital machines still sounded, while applications remained unanswered, while the bills were still due? That question did not fix Daniel's life. It did something quieter. It made room for the possibility that God's silence was not the same as God's absence. Daniel stood at the hospital window and watched the first light touch the buildings. He did not feel certain. He did not feel brave. But he whispered, "If you are here, help me notice." It was a smaller prayer than the ones he used to pray. It did not ask for a complete map of the future. It asked for enough light to recognize the next step. Behind him, a door opened. A man in a simple grey sweater stepped into the corridor, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Daniel had seen him earlier, speaking with another family. He was perhaps in his early 60s, with kind eyes and the patient posture of someone who did not rush silence. A hospital identification badge hung from his collar. The man looked toward Daniel, then toward the sleeping woman beneath Daniel's coat. "Long night?" he asked. Daniel almost gave the usual answer. "We're okay. We'll figure it out." Instead, he looked at the stranger and said, "I'm not sure where God is in any of this." The man did not flinch. He did not offer a quick verse or tell Daniel that everything happened for a reason. He handed him one of the coffees, leaned against the wall beside him, and looked out at the waking city. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we can begin there." Daniel did not yet know that this quiet conversation would change the way he understood Psalm 46. He did not know that the command to be still would first require him to stop hiding, stop performing, and stop measuring God's presence by the condition of his circumstances. He only knew that someone had entered the room without trying to escape his pain. And sometimes, before God changes the storm, he sends a presence that helps us survive the next hour. Daniel looked again at the wooden cross in his hand. The city below was beginning to move. His father was still ill. His job was still gone. His family was still. Nothing had become simple. Yet beneath the noise, almost too quiet to name, a question had begun to replace his certainty that he was alone. What if God had not left the room? The man's name was Michael Reeves, and he served as one of the hospital chaplains. He did not begin by asking Daniel whether he attended church, how often he prayed, or whether he had enough faith. He simply stood beside him at the window while morning spread slowly over the city. The coffee between Daniel's hands was too hot to drink, but he welcomed the warmth. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Daniel had become accustomed to people filling silence with advice. Friends sent messages telling him to stay positive. Former co-workers assured him that something better would come. Members of his church promised that God had a plan. The words were kind, but they often left Daniel feeling more alone, as though grief were a problem he should solve before making others uncomfortable. Michael seemed untroubled by the unfinished nature of the moment. "My father is in there," Daniel finally said, nodding toward the closed doors. "He may recover. They don't know how much. I lost my job 3 days ago. My wife is trying not to be afraid. My daughter knows something is wrong, and I keep hearing people say, God is with me. He swallowed and looked down at the cross in his palm. But I don't feel anything. Michael watched the rainwater gather along the edge of the window. When you say you don't feel anything, he asked, do you mean you feel nothing at all? Or that you do not feel what you expected God's presence to feel like? The question irritated Daniel. It sounded too careful, too much like something a trained counselor would ask. I expected help, he said. I expected some sense that I'm not carrying this by myself. Michael nodded. And because the circumstances have not changed, you have concluded that help has not come. Daniel turned toward him. Has it? Michael did not defend God with a neat argument. He did not tell Daniel that his suffering was secretly a blessing, or that stronger faith would make the fear disappear. He took a slow breath. I don't know yet what help will look like in your story, he said. But Psalm 46 does not say trouble is imaginary. It says God is found in it. That is different from saying God always removes it quickly. Daniel looked away. He had heard similar ideas before, but the hospital corridor gave them a sharper edge. It is easy to speak about divine presence when the people you love are well and the future is predictable. It is harder when a door separates you from someone whose heart has nearly stopped. Michael continued gently. Most of us search for God in the outcome. We look for the scan to be clear, the account to be full, the relationship to be restored, the door to open. Those things matter. It is right to pray for them. But if the outcome is the only place we are willing to recognize God, we may miss the ways He is already holding us before the answer comes. Daniel wanted to ask what that holding looked like. Before he could speak, a nurse approached and told him his father was awake for a few minutes. Daniel thanked Michael quickly and followed her through the doors. His father's eyes opened when Daniel entered. The room was dim, except for the light above the bed. Tubes and wires made the familiar body appear unfamiliar. Daniel pulled a chair close and sat down. "Hey, Dad." His father turned his head slightly. "Your mother?" he whispered. "She's resting. I'm here." The older man's hand moved across the blanket. Daniel took it. The grip was weak. For most of Daniel's life, his father had expressed love through work. Repaired shelves, changed oil, cut grass. Money quietly placed in an envelope when Daniel and Claire were newly married. He rarely spoke about fear. Now his eyes searched Daniel's face. "I heard you lost the job," he said. Daniel was surprised. "Mum told you?" His father nodded faintly. "I'm sorry." Daniel forced a smile. "Don't worry about that. Just get better." His father closed his eyes for a moment. "You don't have to sound strong for me." The sentence entered Daniel more deeply than his father could have known. He looked at their joined hands. The skin across his father's knuckles was thin and spotted with age. "I don't know what I'm doing," Daniel admitted. His father's eyes opened again. "Neither did I," he said. "Most days." A small smile touched his mouth. "You thought I did." The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Daniel laughed once, quietly, and then tears came without warning. He lowered his head. His father did not tell him to stop. He could not lift his arm far, but his fingers tightened around Daniel's hand. For 2 minutes, perhaps 3, nothing in the room improved. Yet Daniel was no longer alone inside his fear. When he returned to the waiting area, Michael had gone. But one of the coffee cups remained on the windowsill. Daniel's mother was awake. She had found a comb in her purse and was trying to arrange her hair. "How is he?" she asked. Tired, awake for a little while, Daniel sat beside her. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He noticed things he would usually have overlooked. The way her hands shook when she folded the tissue, the pressure of her weight against him, the quiet footsteps of a nurse who slowed before entering each room. Perhaps this was what Michael meant. Daniel had been searching for a dramatic sign large enough to cancel his fear. But around him were smaller mercies that did not cancel the fear. They entered it. That afternoon, Claire sent a message. "Emma made you a picture. No need to answer. We are praying." A photograph followed. In purple crayon, Emma had drawn 4 figures holding hands beneath an enormous yellow sun. Daniel's father was included, standing slightly taller than everyone else. Above them, in uneven letters, Emma had written, "God is here." Daniel stared at the words. He knew Claire had probably helped her spell them. He also knew a child's drawing could not resolve medical uncertainty. Still, something inside him softened. For days he had been asking where God was while measuring every answer against the scale of his crisis. He had not considered that God's nearness might arrive in a 9-year-old's purple crayon. The human heart often confuses intensity with reality. Fear shouts, grief repeats itself. Anxiety rehearses the worst possible ending until it feels more certain than the present moment. God's presence, by contrast, may come without force. It may not argue with every thought. It may not overwhelm the senses. It may be as quiet as a hand on the shoulder, a nurse who says a patient's name with tenderness, a meal left at the door, or a person who sits nearby and refuses to offer explanations. Because such things appear ordinary, we often call them coincidence, politeness, or routine. But grace has always been comfortable wearing ordinary clothes. Daniel spent the next 2 days moving between the hospital and home. Each time he entered the building, he noticed Michael speaking with someone else. A young mother near the elevators, an elderly man outside the chapel, 2 brothers arguing softly beside a vending machine. Michael never seemed to be delivering speeches. He listened. On Sunday afternoon, Daniel found him alone in the small interfaith chapel on the 1st floor. The room contained plain wooden chairs, a table, a few candles, and windows made cloudy by years of weather. Daniel stood near the door. "Do you have a minute?" Michael motioned toward a chair. Daniel sat, still wearing his coat. "You asked whether I'm only looking at the circumstances," he said. "I've been thinking about that." Michael waited. "I noticed some things," Daniel continued. My father said something I needed to hear. My daughter sent me a picture. People have helped. But I don't want to pretend small kindnesses make everything okay. They don't, Michael said. Then how are they evidence of anything? Daniel's voice carried more frustration than he intended. A kind nurse is a kind nurse. My daughter loves me. My wife is trying. Why call that God? Michael folded his hands. You do not have to force every good thing into a religious explanation. But you might ask a different question. Why have we decided that only the extraordinary can reveal God? Scripture is full of fire, seas dividing, angels, and impossible doors opening. But it is also full of bread, water, touch, friendship, tears, shared meals, and people staying when others leave. The God revealed in Scripture is not embarrassed by ordinary means. He glanced toward the candles. Sometimes we miss presence because we are waiting for spectacle. Daniel considered this. So I'm supposed to be grateful while my father is sick? No, Michael answered. You are allowed to be frightened. You are allowed to ask for healing. You are allowed to grieve what has been lost. Gratitude that denies pain is not gratitude. It is avoidance. But pain that denies every mercy can become another kind of blindness. The room grew quiet. Somewhere beyond the wall, an announcement echoed through the hospital. Michael leaned forward slightly. You can hold both. This is terrible, and I am not abandoned. I do not understand, and God has not left the room. Those paired sentences followed Daniel home. This is terrible. I am not abandoned. He repeated them while standing in the kitchen after midnight. The house was silent. Claire had fallen asleep on the couch while waiting for him. A blanket had slipped to the floor. Daniel lifted it and covered her. On the table lay a folder containing a revised budget. Claire had highlighted expenses they could reduce and written notes in the margin. At the bottom she had added, "We are a team, even when we are scared." Daniel sat beside her and watched the rise and fall of her breathing. The problems remained, but the room no longer seemed empty. The next morning, he woke before everyone else and opened Psalm 46 again. This time he paused over the idea that God is very present in trouble, near, available, not reluctant. Daniel had often imagined prayer as climbing toward God, as though enough concentration or holiness might finally reach him. But the psalm began with the opposite movement. God was already the refuge. God was already near. The invitation was not to summon him into the crisis, but to awaken to the one who had entered before Daniel understood what was happening. That thought did not create an emotion he could name. It created resistance. If God was present, why had he allowed the week to unfold this way? Why had Daniel lost his job at the same time his father became ill? Why did presence sometimes appear so much weaker than prevention? Daniel wrote the questions in a notebook because he was tired of carrying them in circles. The page filled quickly. At the bottom, he wrote, I do not only want God with me in trouble. I want God to stop the trouble. The sentence looked almost disrespectful. Yet when he read it again, it felt honest. Many believers quietly carry the fear that honesty will offend God. They edit their prayers, remove anger, replace confusion with acceptable phrases, and approach the one who knows them completely while pretending to be someone else. But the Bible's prayers are rarely so polished. They include questions, grief, protest, longing, and the ache of waiting. God does not require us to call darkness light before entering His presence. He asks us to come. Daniel began to see that perhaps faith was not the absence of difficult questions. Perhaps faith was bringing those questions toward God instead of allowing them to drive him away. He returned to the hospital that afternoon and found his mother speaking with a nurse named Lena. Lena was explaining the medication schedule slowly, writing each instruction in large letters. When she finished, Daniel thanked her. "My mum has trouble remembering all the details when she's worried." Lena smiled. "Most people do. That's why we write it down." She placed the paper in a blue folder and added her work number. "Call if anything is confusing." Later, Daniel realized she had stayed 15 minutes beyond the end of her shift. No trumpet sounded. No one announced a miracle. A tired nurse simply gave time she did not have to people who needed it. That evening, Daniel's church friend Aaron arrived carrying soup and a bag of groceries. Daniel almost refused. He and Aaron had not spoken deeply in months, and accepting help felt like admitting the crisis was real. "We're managing," Daniel said. Aaron looked at the cardboard box from Daniel's office, still sitting near the stairs. "I know," he replied. "This isn't because you're failing. Claire told my wife what happened. Let us stand with you." Daniel felt heat rise in his face. Pride can disguise itself as independence. And independence can feel noble while quietly making love impossible to receive. He stepped aside and let Aaron enter. At dinner, Emma talked about a class project involving rivers. She described how water could move around stones, cut through soil, and continue finding a path even when the ground changed. Daniel listened more carefully than he normally would have. Rivers, he would later discover, were also at the heart of Psalm 46. Outside the city of fear, waters roared. Inside the place of God's presence, a river brought life. The contrast had been there all along, waiting for him. But first he needed to learn that God's nearness was not always an emotion descending from heaven. Sometimes it was mercy moving through the people already seated at the table. That night, Claire found him washing dishes long after the kitchen was clean. "You've washed that plate 3 times, she said. Daniel looked at the plate and laughed quietly. Claire leaned against the counter. "How was your dad?" "A little stronger. They may move him out of intensive care tomorrow." "That's good." "It is." Daniel set the plate down. "I met the chaplain again." Claire nodded. "Did it help?" Daniel considered the question. "I think so." He said God's silence isn't the same as God leaving. Claire looked towards the dark window. "Do you believe that?" "I want to." Claire walked closer. "I've been afraid to tell you something." Daniel's body tightened. "What?" "I've been angry too. not just scared. Angry that this is happening. Angry that you shut me out when you're afraid. Angry at myself because I know you're trying." She wiped at her eyes. "And then I feel guilty for being angry when your father is sick." Daniel started to apologize, but Claire shook her head. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I just need us to stop pretending." Her words revealed another room Daniel had left without noticing. God had not abandoned them, but Daniel and Claire had begun abandoning each other through silence. They stood in the kitchen while the dishwasher hummed and spoke more honestly than they had in months. Not everything was resolved. Some sentences hurt. Claire admitted that she often felt like a problem Daniel managed rather than a person he trusted. Daniel confessed that he feared her disappointment more than the job loss itself. When the conversation ended, they were both exhausted, yet the space between them felt less crowded by things unsaid. This is one of the hidden ways Refuge is built, not by walls high enough to prevent pain from entering, but by truth strong enough to keep fear from isolating us. God's presence does not always remove us from difficult rooms. Sometimes He teaches us how to remain in them, with Him and with one another. The hospital waiting room, the kitchen after midnight, the car beneath the overpass. These were not sacred because they were peaceful. They became sacred because honesty entered them. Several days later, Daniel's father was moved to a regular cardiac unit. The change was encouraging, but recovery remained uncertain. Daniel stood beside the bed while a physical therapist helped his father sit upright. The effort left the older man pale and breathless. Daniel felt hope and grief at the same time. Improvement was real, but so was weakness. Life refused to become a simple story in which one good development erased every fear. On his way out, Daniel met Michael near the elevator. "He's improving," Daniel said, slowly. "I'm glad." Daniel hesitated. "You said there was something people miss in Psalm 46, about God being present." Michael nodded. The psalm does not describe God as arriving after the shaking. His presence is the first truth it gives us. Before the mountains move, before the waters roar, before the nations rage, God is already refuge. The elevator doors opened, but neither man entered. Michael continued, "That order matters. Trouble may be the first thing you feel, but it is not the first reality." Daniel carried the sentence into the parking garage. Trouble may be the first thing you feel, but it is not the first reality. He repeated it while searching for his car. Fear had told him that the job loss was the beginning of the story, that the hospital call was the moment everything changed, that chaos had arrived before God could prepare a place for him. But what if refuge preceded the storm? What if grace had been present before Daniel recognized his need for it? He sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine. Instead, he placed both hands open on his knees. "God," he whispered, "I still want you to change this. I still want my father healed. I still need work. I still don't know what will happen. But if you are already here, teach me how to live like I am not alone." The prayer was interrupted by his phone. Claire's name appeared on the screen. Daniel answered quickly. Her breathing was uneven. Behind her, he could hear voices and the echo of a large room. "Daniel," she said, "I'm at Emma's school. Something happened." The peace he had begun to notice did not protect him from the next wave. It did, however, give him one small choice he had not possessed a week earlier. Before panic could write the entire story, Daniel closed his eyes and took one breath. "God is here," he told himself. Then he asked, "Is she safe?" Claire's answer would lead him into a fear deeper than money or employment. It would reveal that the storm Daniel believed he had been hiding from his daughter had already entered her small heart. And in the quiet bedroom that night, Daniel would discover the river beneath the noise. By the time Daniel reached Emma's school, the rain had returned. Not the violent storm of the previous week, but a steady silver rain that blurred the playground and turned the parking lot into a sheet of reflected light. Claire stood beneath the covered entrance with one arm around Emma's shoulders. Their daughter looked smaller than usual inside her red coat. A teacher waited nearby, speaking quietly with the school counsellor. Daniel parked badly, left the door unlocked, and hurried toward them. Emma did not run to him. She kept her face lowered and held the sleeves of her coat over her hands. "What happened?" Daniel asked. Claire touched his arm. "She couldn't breathe. She started crying during class. They thought it might be an asthma attack, but the nurse believes it was panic." The word struck Daniel with a different kind of force. Panic belonged to adults with mortgages, hospital forms, and memories of everything that could go wrong. It did not belong to a 9-year-old who still arranged stuffed animals along her pillow. Inside the counsellor's office, the lights were soft and the walls were painted pale green. Emma sat between her parents while the counsellor explained what she had observed. During a class discussion about family emergencies, Emma became frightened, said her chest hurt, and asked repeatedly whether people could lose their house if a parent lost a job. Daniel felt Claire's eyes move toward him. They had never told Emma they might lose the house. They had never even said those words to each other. Yet children are skilled readers of silence. They notice unopened mail, conversations that stop when they enter a room, the way a parent stares too long at a bank screen, the whispered question after bedtime. Emma had gathered fragments of fear and built a future from them. On the drive home, she sat in the back seat without speaking. Daniel watched her in the mirror. The school counsellor had assured them that one episode did not define her and had suggested several ways to support her. Still, Daniel felt a heavy guilt. He had believed silence protected Emma. In reality, silence had left her alone with an imagination far more frightening than the truth. Reached home, Claire made tea and soup while Daniel carried Emma's backpack upstairs. In her room, the purple drawing still hung above the desk. 4 people holding hands beneath the words, "God is here." The confidence of the picture hurt him. Had Emma written the words because she believed them, or because she needed someone else to believe them for her? That evening, Daniel sat beside her on the floor. Emma had changed into pajamas and wrapped herself in a blanket. Rain clicked softly against the glass. He wanted to begin with reassurance, but every sentence he imagined sounded incomplete. We are not going to lose everything. He could not guarantee that. Grandpa will be fine. He did not know. Dad will find another job. He hoped so. The desire to protect a child can tempt a parent to promise control over things no human being controls. Daniel remembered Michael's words, "Pain that denies every mercy becomes blindness. But gratitude that denies pain becomes avoidance." He needed a way to tell the truth without making fear the only truth in the room. "Your counselor told us you got scared today," he said. Emma nodded. "I thought I was going to stop breathing." That must have felt awful. Another nod. "Were you thinking about Grandpa?" "And the house?" Her voice was almost too quiet to hear. "I heard Mom say we have to be careful with money, and you're always at the hospital, and you don't laugh anymore." Daniel looked down. A child had summarized his condition more accurately than any adult. Emma continued, "Are we going to be okay?" The question was simple. The answer was not. Daniel felt the old reflex rise. "We'll figure it out." Instead, he let the silence remain for a moment. "I don't know exactly what every part of okay will look like," he said. Emma's eyes lifted towards him. "Grandpa is still sick, but the doctors are helping him. I don't have a job right now, but I'm looking. Mum and I are making a plan, and whatever happens, you will not have to face it alone. We will tell you the truth. We will listen when you're scared. We will ask for help. And God will be with us, even on the days we don't feel brave." Emma considered this. "Can God be here when people are scared?" "Especially then," Daniel answered, hoping the words were true enough for both of them. She moved closer and rested against his shoulder. For a while they listened to the rain. Daniel noticed how different the sound became when he stopped trying to answer every question. It was no longer the noise beneath an overpass or the storm that followed him from one crisis to another. It was water moving across a roof, ordinary, repetitive, almost gentle. On Emma's desk lay a library book about rivers, open to a photograph of water passing between dark stones. Daniel remembered her explanation at dinner. Water finds a path even when the ground changes. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Daniel opened Psalm 46 again. He read the images slowly. First, the roaring waters of chaos. Then, unexpectedly, a river whose streams bring gladness to the city of God. Two kinds of water inside the same song. One threatens to swallow the world. The other quietly sustains life. Daniel had always remembered the mountains and the command to be still, but not the river. Perhaps because the river did not demand attention. It did not roar. It flowed. The contrast felt personal. His outer life was filled with loud water, the hospital monitor, the unanswered applications, the fear of financial collapse, Emma's panic, the tension between him and Claire. Each problem announced itself with urgency, yet beneath that noise, another current had begun to move. his father's honesty, Claire's willingness to speak, Emma leaning against him, Michael's patient questions, Aaron carrying groceries through the door. None of these had removed the storm. Together, they had made it possible to breathe inside it. We often imagine peace as the moment noise disappears. Scripture offers something deeper. Peace as the presence of a current the noise cannot stop. The river in Psalm 46 does not wait until the nations are calm. It flows while the world trembles. It suggests that God's life can move beneath circumstances that remain unstable. This is difficult to trust because the roaring water is easier to measure. We can count bills, days without work, medical appointments, and hours of lost sleep. The quiet river rarely arrives with numbers. It appears as enough courage for one conversation, enough patience for one more day, enough humility to accept help, enough hope to pray again. Daniel began testing this idea in small ways. The next morning, before checking email, he sat in the parked car for 3 minutes. He did not turn on the radio. He did not make a list. He placed his hands on the steering wheel and listened to his breathing. At first, stillness made him more anxious. Without noise, his thoughts became louder. What if no one responds? What if Dad cannot live alone? What if Emma gets worse? What if Claire is tired of me? Daniel almost reached for his phone. Instead, he whispered, "God, help me stay here." He did not ask to feel peaceful. He asked not to run. The practice was so small that he felt foolish mentioning it. Yet, he returned to it throughout the day. Before opening a rejection email, he took one breath. Before entering his father's room, he placed a hand on the door and prayed. "Give me grace for what is true." Before answering Claire when her tone sounded sharp, he paused long enough to notice that her sharpness came from exhaustion rather than hostility. These pauses did not transform him into a calm man. Sometimes he still reacted quickly. Sometimes his mind raced for an hour after a 3-minute silence. But he began discovering that panic was not the only voice available to him. On Wednesday, Daniel received a call from a recruiter. A company across town wanted to schedule an interview. The position was similar to his previous role and paid slightly more. For the first time since losing his job, hope rose quickly. He thanked the recruiter, wrote down the details, and immediately began imagining the future repaired. He saw the mortgage paid, the emergency fund restored, Claire smiling with relief, Emma secure. By the time the call ended, Daniel had emotionally accepted a job he had not yet interviewed for. When he told Claire, she hugged him. "That's wonderful." Then she added carefully, "It's an interview." Daniel felt irritation. "I know what it is. I'm only saying we should protect our hearts. I said I know." The room cooled. Claire returned to the laundry. Daniel opened his laptop and began researching the company with unnecessary intensity. Within minutes, stillness had become impossible. Hope, when mixed with desperation, can produce another form of panic. Daniel rehearsed answers, revised his resume, calculated the commute, and searched the names of the interviewers. He wanted the opportunity to become a guarantee before the day ended. The river had not stopped flowing, but Daniel had rushed back toward the roar. That night, Claire found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed pages. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to take away your hope." Daniel looked at the screen. "You didn't. I know you need this. We need this." Claire sat across from him. "Yes, but I don't want one phone call to carry the weight of saving us." Daniel's first instinct was to argue. Instead, he saw the truth in her face. He had turned the interview into a rescue. And anything forced to become a savior will eventually become a source of fear. He closed the laptop. "Would you pray with me?" he asked. Claire seemed surprised. They had prayed before meals and during his father's hospitalization, but rarely with such direct need between them. She reached across the table. Daniel began with familiar phrases, then stopped. "God, I want this job," he said. "I want it badly. I want the money and the relief. I want to feel useful again. But I don't want fear to make this opportunity bigger than you." His voice shook. "Help me prepare without pretending the outcome belongs to me." Claire squeezed his hand. Her prayer was shorter. "Give us what we need for tomorrow and help us recognize it." The interview took place 2 days later in a polished conference room overlooking the river that crossed the city. Daniel wore his navy jacket and answered questions carefully. The hiring manager seemed interested. Another interviewer nodded several times while taking notes. Daniel left, convinced he had performed well. As he walked toward the parking garage, he felt something close to confidence. Then his phone rang. It was the hospital. His father's blood pressure had dropped during physical therapy. The doctors were evaluating him again. Within an hour, Daniel was back beneath fluorescent lights. Hope and fear moved through him so quickly that he felt dizzy. The interview seemed distant, almost unreal. His mother paced beside the window. Claire was arranging for someone to pick up Emma. Daniel tried to listen to the physician, but every sentence split into possible disasters. Additional tests, medication adjustment, monitoring. No immediate evidence of another major event, but concern remained. The ground had not stopped moving simply because one good door appeared. That evening, his father stabilized. Daniel sat beside the bed, exhausted by the emotional distance between the interview room and the hospital room. His father slept. Machines cast green light across his face. Daniel opened the Notes app on his phone and wrote 2 sentences. "Good news is not God arriving. Bad news is not God leaving." He stared at them. The words did not mean outcomes were unimportant. They meant God could not be reduced to them. This was the deeper work of the river. It was teaching Daniel to receive hope without worshipping it, and to face fear without obeying it. The current of God's presence did not depend on the day remaining consistent. It could hold joy and sorrow in the same hour. It could flow through an interview, a medical setback, a child's anxious question, and a quiet prayer at the kitchen table. Daniel did not have to decide which moment proved God was with him. Presence was not a prize awarded to the favorable parts of life. When the company called the following Monday, the hiring manager's voice was kind. They had chosen another candidate with more experience in a specialized area. Daniel thanked her and ended the call. For several seconds, he stood motionless in the hallway. Then anger surged. He walked into the bedroom and threw his folder onto the floor, papers scattered beneath the dresser. "Of course," he said. "Of course they did." Claire came to the doorway. "Daniel?" "I did everything right. I prepared. I prayed. I didn't make it an idol. I tried to trust God, and it still didn't matter." Claire did not correct him. She sat on the edge of the bed. Daniel paced. "I'm tired of lessons," he said. "I don't need another lesson about patience. I need work. I need Dad to recover. I need our daughter not to be afraid." The words grew louder. "I need God to do something." He stopped near the window. The anger frightened him, not because it was violent, but because it felt honest. Beneath it was grief. Beneath grief, helplessness. Beneath helplessness, the old belief that if he could not control the outcome, he had failed. Stillness had seemed gentle when he practiced it in the car. Now it became a doorway into emotions he had avoided for years. Without constant activity, Daniel could hear the accusations inside him. "You are only valuable when you provide. You are safe only when you can predict what happens next. People will love you until you disappoint them. God is near only when He gives you what you ask for." These beliefs had not begun with the job loss. The crisis had simply removed the walls that kept them hidden. Daniel sat on the floor among the scattered papers. Claire moved beside him. "I'm angry at God," he whispered. "Then tell Him," she said. "I just did." "You told me." Electrome looked at her. "Tell Him." That night, after Claire and Emma were asleep, Daniel returned to the kitchen table. Rain had ended, but drops still moved down the window from the roof. He opened the Bible and did not read. He placed both hands flat on the table. "God, I am angry with you," he said. The sentence sounded too loud in the sleeping house. He continued. "I asked for help. I thought that interview was help. I thought if I trusted you correctly, maybe you would let me have it. I know faith doesn't work like a bargain. I know all the right answers, but I am angry that you could change this and have not." He waited. No voice answered. Daniel spoke again. He told God about the shame of carrying a box through the office lobby. He admitted he resented his father for becoming ill at the worst possible time, then wept because the thought felt cruel. He confessed that Claire's strength sometimes made him feel unnecessary. He admitted he was afraid Emma would remember this season as the time her father disappeared into worry. He named every thought he had edited from prayer. The silence did not condemn him. It held. Daniel began to understand that the river was not asking him to become numb. It was creating a place where truth could move without destroying him. God's peace was not a lid pressed over grief. It was a deeper container, large enough to receive anger, fear, love, disappointment, and hope, without allowing any one of them to become the whole story. Near 2 in the morning, Daniel rested his head on his folded arms. His prayer had become quiet. He was not calmer because circumstances had changed. He was calmer because he had stopped fighting to keep part of himself outside God's presence. The river beneath the noise was not an emotion he could manufacture. It was the strange mercy of being fully known and not cast away. Before leaving the table, he opened Psalm 46 once more. His eyes moved towards the command near the end. Be still, and know that I am God. Daniel had always heard the words as an invitation to relax. That night, they sounded more demanding. Be still. Stop grasping. Stop trying to force the future into shape. Stop treating your fear as Lord. Know that I am God, not you. The realization unsettled him. Stillness was not merely comfort, it was surrender, and surrender would soon ask more of Daniel than a quiet prayer in the middle of the night. It would ask him to release the identity he had built around control, to become honest with Claire about the distance between them, and to face an opportunity that promised safety at the cost of something deeper. Daniel closed the Bible. On the table beside it, his phone lit with a new email. The subject line read, "Employment opportunity, immediate opening." He opened it and recognized the name of a former colleague. The message offered exactly what he had been praying for: quick work, excellent pay, and no long hiring process. For a few moments, Daniel felt only relief. Then he read the final paragraph, and the relief changed shape. He knew the company. He knew why the position was open. He knew what would be expected of him. Outside, water moved quietly through the gutters toward the river. Inside, Daniel stared at the screen and realized that sometimes the loudest storm is not the trouble we want to escape. Sometimes it is the fear that tells us any escape is worth taking. The email came from Victor Hale, a man Daniel had worked with nearly a decade earlier. Victor had always possessed the kind of confidence that made uncertainty look like a personal weakness. He knew which conversations mattered, which numbers could be adjusted without attracting attention, and how to speak about profit in a way that made human consequences disappear. Daniel had respected him once. Later, he had learned to keep his distance. Victor now served as operations director for a private consulting firm that was expanding quickly. The message was warm, almost generous. He had heard about Daniel's position being eliminated. He needed someone immediately. There would be no long interview process, no weeks of waiting, and no concern about salary. "You have the exact discipline I need," Victor wrote. "We can solve each other's problems." Daniel read the email 3 times beneath the yellow kitchen light. On the 4th reading, he noticed the sentences that had troubled him. The position would involve strategic reporting flexibility and managing client perception during restructuring. He knew what those phrases meant. Victor's company specialized in helping struggling businesses appear healthier while they cut staff, delayed obligations, and moved risk toward people with the least power to resist. None of it was described as illegal. That was part of the danger. Harm was hidden beneath clean language. Daniel would not be asked to steal money or sign a false statement on the first day. He would be asked to move one number, omit one warning, soften one report, and trust that someone above him carried responsibility for the rest. The salary was almost 30% higher than the job he had lost. Health insurance would begin immediately. Victor offered a signing bonus large enough to cover 2 months of expenses and part of his father's medical costs. Daniel leaned back from the screen. His first thought was not about integrity. It was about relief. He imagined telling Claire they would be safe. He imagined paying the mortgage without calculating what remained. He imagined walking into the hospital without the private terror of every bill. Fear can make compromise look like provision, especially when compromise arrives carrying exactly what we believe we need. He did not wake Claire. He replied that he was interested and would call in the morning. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark. A quiet pressure spread through his chest. He told himself it was excitement. He told himself every company used complicated language. He told himself he could accept the role and influence the culture from within. He told himself responsibility to his family mattered more than personal discomfort. Each explanation was reasonable enough to survive 1 minute. None survived stillness. At breakfast, Daniel described the offer while Emma ate cereal and drew circles in the milk with her spoon. He emphasized the salary, the insurance, and the speed of the process. Claire listened without interrupting. "What does the company do?" she asked. "Consulting, operational recovery." "Do you trust them?" Daniel reached for his coffee. "I trust that they can pay me." Claire waited. Daniel disliked the silence because it made his answer sound as incomplete as it was. "Victor can be aggressive," he added, "but I wouldn't have to become him." Claire looked toward Emma and lowered her voice. "Is he asking you to do something wrong?" "Not directly." "Would you know if he was?" Daniel's irritation rose. "We don't have the luxury of investigating every imperfect company as if we're choosing a church." Claire's face changed. "I didn't say we did." The conversation ended when Emma asked whether she could wear mismatched socks to school. Daniel drove her that morning and tried to enjoy her explanation that matching was a rule made by people without imagination. Yet Victor's offer followed him. At a red light, he pictured the signing bonus. In the school parking lot, he remembered the phrase, "managing client perception." On the drive to the hospital, he argued with a version of Claire who was not present. She does not understand the pressure. She wants honesty, but also wants the bills paid. Someone has to make the hard decision. By the time he reached his father's room, Daniel had nearly convinced himself that accepting the job was an act of sacrifice. His father was sitting in a chair beside the bed, wearing a hospital gown and a grey blanket around his shoulders. The effort of moving had exhausted him, but his eyes were clearer. Daniel told him about the offer, expecting encouragement. His father listened, then asked, "Do you want the work?" I want the stability. That wasn't my question. Daniel looked toward the window. I could do it. I know. His father adjusted the blanket. You've always been able to do things you didn't want to do. Daniel smiled faintly. That's called being an adult. Sometimes. The older man breathed slowly. Sometimes it's called being afraid. Daniel felt defensive. It's easy to talk about fear when you're not looking at the bills. His father's expression tightened, and Daniel regretted the words immediately. But his father did not turn away. You think I never looked at bills? He asked. You think I never took work I hated because you needed shoes? Then you understand. I understand more than you think. His father looked down at his hands. There were choices I called sacrifice because I didn't want to admit I was scared. Some of them made me hard. Some made me absent, even when I was in the house. He paused. Providing for your family matters, but do not use your family as an excuse to become someone they never asked you to be. Daniel said nothing. His father's words opened a memory. Daniel was 12, waiting beside a window for his father to attend a school performance. The chair remained empty. Later, his father arrived home, angry and exhausted, carrying overtime pay and an apology that sounded like an explanation. Daniel had long understood that moment as proof of love. His father missed things because he worked for the family. Now he saw another truth beside it. Love had been present, but so had fear. One did not erase the other. On the way home, Daniel stopped at the small church near the hospital. The sanctuary was open for midday prayer, though no one else was there. Sunlight fell through coloured windows and made quiet shapes across the wooden floor. Daniel sat in the last row. He did not feel spiritual. He felt cornered. The offer was real. The needs were real. The concern in his conscience was also real. He opened Psalm 46 on his phone and read the command again. Be still and know that I am God. For years, Daniel had interpreted stillness as a mood. A peaceful Christian would breathe deeply, trust more, worry less, and move through difficulty with gentle confidence. But the command in the psalm stood amid conflict. Weapons were broken. Wars were brought to an end. Human striving was interrupted by the voice of God. Stillness was not merely the calming of emotions. It was the laying down of weapons. It was the end of the frantic attempt to secure life through force, manipulation, control, or fear. In Daniel's case, the weapon was not a sword. It was the belief that because he loved his family, he had the right to do anything necessary to control the outcome. He whispered, "What does surrender look like here?" The empty sanctuary offered no immediate answer. Daniel imagined rejecting the offer and watching the savings disappear. He imagined accepting and gradually losing the ability to recognize himself. Neither picture felt holy. One felt terrifying, the other felt easier. He realized he had been asking God to remove the need for trust. He wanted an option so obviously right and so financially secure that faith would no longer be necessary. Surrender is often misunderstood as giving up responsibility. It is not. Daniel still needed to apply for work, speak with creditors, help his parents, and care for his family. Biblical surrender does not ask us to become passive. It asks us to stop confusing faithful action with sovereign control. Responsibility says, I will take the next honest step. Control says, I must guarantee the result. Responsibility can rest after obedience. Control never sleeps. Daniel thought of the previous weeks. He had acted as though his family rested on his shoulders alone. When his father said, "Take care of them," Daniel heard, "Become the foundation beneath everyone." When Claire asked what they should do, he heard, "Prove that you deserve our trust." When Emma became frightened, he heard, "Your weakness is harming your child." Every need became a verdict on his worth. No wonder he could not be still. He had placed himself in a position no human heart could survive. The position of God. That afternoon, Daniel met Michael in the hospital cafeteria. The chaplain stirred sugar into tea while Daniel described the offer. Michael asked several practical questions. What exactly would the role require? What did Daniel know about the company? Was the discomfort based on evidence or merely dislike? Daniel appreciated the care. Michael did not treat every uneasy feeling as divine instruction. Faithful decisions require wisdom, not superstition. Daniel explained Victor's history, the firm's reputation, and the language in the email. "I could probably keep my hands clean," he said, "but I would be helping other people hide theirs." Michael nodded. "And what are you afraid will happen if you say no? We'll run out of money. Eventually? Sooner than I want. And if you say yes?" Daniel looked at the table. "I'm afraid I'll tell myself I'm still a good man because the compromise is small. Then the next one will be smaller." Michael did not answer for a moment. "It sounds as though you already know the nature of the choice." Daniel leaned back. "Knowing doesn't make it easier." "No." Sometimes clarity makes obedience harder because we lose the comfort of pretending we're confused. Daniel looked around the cafeteria. Families carried trays past them. A doctor stood near the vending machine, rubbing his eyes. What if saying no hurts the people I'm supposed to protect? Michael's expression softened. You are not choosing between loving your family and obeying God. You are choosing what kind of love you will offer them. Fear says love means guaranteeing comfort at any cost. Faith says love can remain honest even when comfort is uncertain. He took a sip of tea. I cannot promise that refusing this job will produce a better one next week. Trust is not a method for controlling God. But I can tell you that a refuge built on dishonesty will eventually become another storm. Daniel drove home through late afternoon traffic. He did not feel inspired. He felt tired. Surrender is rarely cinematic while it is happening. It often looks like a person sitting in a car, turning off the engine and admitting there is no decision that will remove all fear. He entered the house and found Claire folding laundry at the dining table. Emma was at a friend's home. Daniel sat across from his wife. I was unfair this morning, he said. Claire placed a shirt in the basket. You were scared. That doesn't make it fair. He told her everything he knew about Victor's company. He described the reports, the language, and his concern that the role would require him to participate in deception. Claire listened. Why didn't you tell me all of that before? Because I wanted you to agree before you had enough information to disagree. The admission hurt. Claire sat down. What do you want to do? I want to take the money and not become the kind of person the job requires. Can you? Daniel shook his head. I don't think so. Claire looked at her hands. Then we will say no. Daniel stared at her. We? Yes, we. This is not your private test. It affects all of us. You know what that means. It means we keep living carefully. It means I may take more hours. It means we ask for help. It means we do not know what happens next. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. I need you to hear this clearly. I do not need you to control the future. I need you to be here. I would rather walk through uncertainty with the man you truly are than live comfortably beside someone fear has changed. Daniel lowered his face into his hands. For weeks, he had assumed Claire's security depended on his ability to produce certainty. She was telling him that her deeper need was his presence. He thought of God. Perhaps Daniel had been demanding from himself what God alone could provide, while withholding the one gift his family actually needed from him: an honest, available heart. They spent the next hour reviewing their finances without pretending the numbers frightened them. They could manage for several months if they reduced expenses, accepted help from family, and negotiated one payment. Claire could add 2 shifts each week at the clinic, though childcare would need to be arranged. Daniel could take temporary work while continuing his search. None of it was ideal. None of it was impossible. Panic had told him the Victor offer was the only door. Truth revealed several smaller steps. The following morning, Daniel called Victor. He stood near the kitchen window while Claire listened from the table. Victor answered with cheerful confidence. I knew you'd come around. Daniel thanked him and said he could not accept. There was a pause. Is it the title? We can adjust that. No. The salary? The salary is generous. Victor's tone changed. Then what's the issue? Daniel chose his words carefully. I don't think I can do the work without violating things I need to protect. Victor laughed once. You're unemployed, Daniel. Principals are expensive when someone else is paying the mortgage. The sentence found its target. Daniel felt shame and fear rise together. He looked at Claire. She did not rescue him. She simply remained. Daniel took one breath. That may be true, he said, but I'm still saying no. Victor's friendliness disappeared. Call me when reality catches up with you. The line ended. Daniel stood with the phone in his hand. Nothing changed outside. No new offer arrived. No unexpected deposit appeared. The refrigerator continued humming. A truck passed on the wet street. Yet Daniel felt something release inside him. He had not defeated fear. He had refused to let fear make the decision. The difference was quiet but profound. That afternoon, he took temporary inventory work at a warehouse through a staffing agency. The pay was modest, the hours began before sunrise, and his back hurt after the first shift. Part of him felt humiliated. He had managed teams and budgets. Now he scanned boxes beneath fluorescent lights. But another part felt strangely free. The work was honest. It paid for groceries. He did not need it to prove who he was. When he returned home, Emma ran to the door and asked whether his first day had gone well. Daniel almost described it as a failure. Instead, he said, "It was hard, and I'm grateful to have it for now." Both things were true. Stillness began taking a new form. It was not only silence in the car, it was the ability to stand inside an imperfect day without demanding that the day justify his life. Daniel still applied for positions at night. He still woke with fear. He still checked the bank balance too often. But he practiced placing specific burdens before God. Not, "Please fix everything," though he sometimes prayed that too. He named them. My father's body, Claire's exhaustion, Emma's fear, the mortgage, my pride. Tomorrow's interview, the anger I carry, the future I cannot see. Naming a burden did not make it lighter immediately. It reminded him that the burden existed before a God who knew its true weight. One evening, Daniel and Claire sat on the porch after Emma went to bed. The air was cold, and their breath appeared faintly in the porch light. Claire rested her head against his shoulder. "You've been different," she said. Daniel tensed. "Better or worse?" "More here." He looked toward the dark street. "I still feel afraid almost all the time." "I know." "Then how am I different?" Claire thought for a moment. "Before, fear made you disappear into yourself. Now you tell me when it enters the room." Daniel realized peace was not the absence of fear. It was the end of fear's secrecy. What is brought into love loses some of its power to rule. This was true in marriage, in prayer, and in the hidden chambers of the heart. God's command to be still was not a demand that Daniel become emotionless. It was an invitation to stop running from the truth and stop using control to protect the false self he had worked so hard to maintain. Yet surrender does not end one battle without revealing another. A week after Daniel refused Victor's offer, a different email arrived. It was not a job opportunity. It came from his mother's account, though the message had been typed by someone else. Attached was a photograph of an envelope delivered to his parents' home. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable. Daniel had not seen it in 6 years, but he recognized the sharp angle of the letters immediately. The envelope was from his older brother, Samuel. The name carried a history Daniel had sealed away, their grandmother's final months, the argument after her funeral, money neither man truly cared about, words spoken in grief and defended by pride, birthdays missed, calls unanswered, and the long silence that followed. Daniel had told himself Samuel abandoned the family. Samuel had told others, Daniel believed himself superior. Each brother had turned pain into a story in which the other carried all responsibility. Inside the envelope, his mother said, was a letter addressed to Daniel, and a cheque large enough to cover one immediate medical expense. She had not opened the letter. She wanted to know what he wished her to do. Daniel stared at the photograph on his phone. His first reaction was not gratitude, it was anger. He did not want Samuel's money. He did not want an apology arriving when circumstances made refusal difficult. He did not want to reopen a wound he had learned to live around. Yet beneath the anger was another fear. If he accepted help, he would lose control over the terms of reconciliation. Claire read the message beside him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Daniel enlarged the photograph and studied the familiar handwriting. "I don't know." For weeks, he had asked God for provision. Now help had appeared, wearing the face of the last person he wanted to receive it from. Stillness had taught him to release outcomes. The next lesson would ask him to release the right to decide how grace was allowed to arrive. Samuel's letter remained unopened for 2 days. Daniel's mother placed it in the top drawer of the small desk beside her kitchen window, where she kept stamps, appointment cards, and receipts she intended to organize. Each time Daniel visited the hospital, she asked whether he was ready to take it. Each time, he said no. He told himself that the timing was inappropriate. His father's recovery required attention. The temporary warehouse shifts left him exhausted. Emma had begun meeting with the school counselor, and Claire was working extra hours. There were practical reasons to delay. Yet beneath every reason was a simpler truth. Daniel was afraid that one page could disturb the version of the past he had used to survive. For 6 years, the conflict with Samuel had remained fixed in Daniel's memory. Their grandmother, Ruth, had declined slowly after a stroke. Daniel lived nearby and handled appointments, bills, and visits. Samuel lived 3 states away and arrived only twice during her final year. When Ruth died, the brothers discovered that she had left her small house to both of them. Samuel suggested selling it quickly. Daniel wanted to preserve it, at least for a time. Grief turned the disagreement into accusation. Daniel said Samuel cared only about money. Samuel said Daniel used caregiving to make himself morally superior. Then came the sentence neither could take back. Samuel told him, "You don't love people, Daniel. You manage them." Daniel answered, "At least I stay." The house was eventually sold. The money was divided. The brothers stopped speaking. Daniel built a life in which Samuel's absence confirmed Daniel's faithfulness. Whenever he remembered the argument, he remembered himself standing in the kitchen where their grandmother had baked bread, defending memory against a brother who wanted cash. He did not remember the months when Samuel called, and Daniel ended conversations quickly. He did not remember refusing Samuel's offer to help pay for professional care because Daniel believed no one else would do it correctly. Memory, like fear, is a gifted editor. It preserves the scenes that protect us from repentance. On Friday morning, Daniel reported to the warehouse before dawn. Rows of metal shelving stretched beneath white lights. Forklifts beeped as workers moved pallets across the concrete floor. His task was to scan incoming boxes, confirm quantities, and place labels on damaged shipments. The work required enough attention to occupy his hands, but not enough to quiet his thoughts. He imagined Samuel's letter in the drawer. He imagined it containing excuses. He imagined a request. He imagined a performance of regret designed to make Daniel responsible for reconciliation. By the end of the shift, he had answered a letter he had not read 100 different ways. During lunch, a co-worker named Lewis sat beside him on an overturned crate. Lewis was in his 50s, with silver hair and a habit of bringing 2 sandwiches because someone always forgot food. That day, he offered one to Daniel. Daniel declined, then accepted when he realized he had left his lunch on the kitchen counter. They ate in silence for a while. Lewis noticed the wooden cross Daniel sometimes carried in his pocket and asked whether it belonged to him. Daniel explained that it had been his grandmother's. "She must have mattered," Louise said. "She did. Still does, by the way you said it." Daniel smiled faintly. Perhaps because Luis knew nothing about the family, Daniel told him about the letter. He did not give every detail, but enough for the shape of the conflict to emerge. Luis listened and peeled an orange. When Daniel finished, he asked, "Do you want your brother back, or do you want to be proven right?" Daniel stiffened. "Those aren't the only choices." "No," Louise said, "but sometimes they are the first two." He separated a slice of orange and held it toward Daniel, who shook his head. "My sister and I did not speak for 11 years, Lewis continued. "I waited for her apology. She waited for mine. We were both very patient." His smile carried sadness. "Then she got sick. We made peace, but we gave pride 11 years it did not deserve." Daniel looked across the warehouse. What if the other person still thinks they did nothing wrong? Then forgiveness will not make the past false. Luis wiped his hands on a napkin. But refusing every opening will not make the past heal. The brake buzzer sounded. Luis stood. "Read the letter before you fight with it." That evening, Daniel drove to his mother's house. She was at the hospital with his father, who had begun short assisted walks. The house felt unusually quiet. Family photographs lined the hallway. Daniel and Samuel as boys beside a lake, their father holding a fishing pole, their mother laughing into the wind. In one picture, 12-year-old Daniel sat on Samuel's shoulders. Both were sunburned and smiling. Daniel had forgotten the photograph existed. Conflict had reduced Samuel to the man in the kitchen after the funeral. The image reminded him that no human being can be contained by the worst conversation of his life. Daniel opened the desk drawer and found the envelope. His name filled the front in Samuel's narrow handwriting. The paper had been folded and unfolded before mailing. Daniel carried it to the kitchen table. For several minutes, he rested his fingers along the edge. Then he opened it. Samuel's letter did not begin with explanation. It began with a sentence Daniel had never expected to read. "I have been sorry for 6 years, and pride has made me act as though silence were strength." Daniel stopped. His chest tightened. He continued. Samuel wrote that he had recently learned about their father's heart attack through a distant cousin. He admitted he had avoided contacting their parents because he feared Daniel's rejection and because distance allowed him to believe the family no longer wanted him. He described the guilt of missing Ruth's final months. He had been struggling financially at the time and ashamed to admit it. Selling the house quickly had not been about greed alone. He was in debt and desperate. But when Daniel accused him of caring only about money, Samuel responded by attacking the place where he knew Daniel was most vulnerable. I said you manage people instead of loving them, the letter continued. There was truth hidden inside a cruel sentence, but I used truth as a weapon. You were carrying too much. Instead of seeing that, I punished you for making me feel unnecessary. I am sorry. Samuel did not ask Daniel to forget the past. He did not claim equal blame in every detail. He wrote that the enclosed money was not payment for forgiveness and not an attempt to enter the family through obligation. It was part of what he could offer toward their father's care. Use it or return it, he wrote, but please know I want to speak when you are ready. I do not want another year to become another 6. Daniel read the letter twice. By the end, anger remained, but it no longer stood alone. Grief entered beside it. He saw Samuel not as an enemy returning to disturb peace, but as a frightened brother who had built a prison from the same pride Daniel carried. The two men had spent 6 years defending themselves from one another, while both quietly longing to be released. Psalm 46 speaks of battles ending, bows broken, spears shattered, and instruments of war consumed. Daniel had always imagined those images on the scale of nations. But every family knows smaller wars. Weapons can be sentences repeated long after the speaker regrets them. A silence maintained to punish. A memory sharpened each time it is retold. A refusal to ask what pain existed behind another person's failure. We rarely call these things weapons because they do not draw blood, yet they can shape years. The battle between Daniel and Samuel had become part of Daniel's identity. He was the brother who stayed. Samuel was the brother who left. If reconciliation complicated that story, Daniel would have to surrender more than anger. He would have to surrender the moral certainty that kept him safe from seeing his own part. Forgiveness is not pretending that everyone was equally responsible. It is refusing to keep using another person's wrong as permission to remain unchanged. Daniel placed the letter on the table and prayed, though the prayer felt reluctant. God, I don't know whether I can trust him. He looked at the old family photographs. And I don't know whether I trust myself to speak without trying to win. He wanted a clear instruction. Call now, wait, return the money, accept it. Instead, he sensed only an invitation toward one honest step. He took out his phone and wrote a message. I read your letter. Thank you for writing. I am not ready to solve everything, but I am willing to talk. He stared at the screen before pressing send. Samuel replied 20 minutes later. That is more than I expected. Tell me when. Daniel almost delayed again. Then he suggested Sunday afternoon. The call began awkwardly. Claire took Emma to the park so Daniel could have privacy. He sat at the kitchen table with Samuel's letter beside him. When his brother's face appeared on the screen, Daniel was startled by how much older he looked. Samuel's hair had thinned at the temples. A pair of reading glasses rested on his head. For a moment, neither spoke. "Hi," Samuel said. "Hi." Another silence. "How's Dad?" Daniel explained the recovery, the medications, and the uncertainty about what support he would need at home. Samuel listened carefully. "I should have called Mum." "Yes," Daniel said. The word came out harder than intended. Samuel nodded. "I know." The conversation moved unevenly. Samuel apologized again. Daniel asked why it had taken 6 years. Samuel said shame became harder to cross with each passing month. Daniel accused him of leaving the burden to everyone else. Samuel replied that Daniel rejected help whenever it did not arrive in the form he wanted. Old heat entered their voices. At one point, Daniel nearly ended the call. Then, he saw the letter on the table and remembered Luis. "Do you want your brother back? Or do you want to be proven right?" "I don't want to repeat the funeral," Daniel said. Samuel exhaled. "Neither do I." Daniel looked toward the window. "You were right about one thing." Samuel waited. "I manage people when I'm afraid. I call it taking responsibility. Sometimes it is. Sometimes I use it to keep anyone from seeing that I need them." Samuel removed his glasses from his head. "And you were right that I left," he said. "I had reasons. Some were real, but I left." Neither sentence repaired 6 years. It did something more believable. It made room for a future that was not identical to the past. Samuel asked whether Daniel would accept the money for their father's care. Daniel wanted to refuse from pride and accept from need. He chose a third way. "We can use part of it for the first month of home support," he said. "But I want us to decide together what Dad needs after that." Samuel nodded. Together. The word sounded unfamiliar. After the call, Daniel remained at the table. He did not feel the dramatic lightness he expected forgiveness to bring. He felt grief for time lost. Reconciliation often begins not with joy, but with mourning. Once the battle pauses, we can finally see the landscape it damaged. Daniel thought of holidays, illnesses, Emma growing from a toddler into a child who barely knew her uncle. He wept for years pride could not return. When Claire came home, she found him washing his face at the sink. "How did it go?" "Hard." "Bad?" Daniel considered. "No, just true." He told her about the conversation and the decision regarding the money. Claire embraced him. "I'm proud of you." Electro shook his head. "I don't feel proud. I feel late." "Grace can meet us late," she said. Late is not the same as never. The next week brought no single miracle, but several changes began moving at once. Samuel called their mother. She cried so hard she could not speak for the first minute. He spoke briefly with their father, whose voice remained weak. Daniel stood beside the hospital bed and watched his father close his eyes as Samuel said, "I'm sorry I stayed away." Their father answered, "Come home when you can." No one explained 6 years. Love did not require a complete summary before opening the door. Daniel's father was discharged 10 days later. Returning home was both joyful and frightening. The living room had been rearranged to make space for a medical recliner. Medication bottles lined the kitchen counter. A home health nurse reviewed instructions. Daniel's mother looked overwhelmed. Samuel travelled in for the weekend and slept on the old couch. The brothers moved carefully around each other, polite at first. Then their father asked them to repair a loose railing beside the front steps. The task was ordinary enough to expose their habits. Daniel measured everything twice and corrected Samuel's angle. Samuel joked that Daniel had become a foreman. Daniel almost took offense, then saw the smile. "And you still refuse to read instructions," he answered. They worked until sunset. At one point, Samuel held the railing steady while Daniel tightened the final screw. Their hands were close on the wood. Neither mentioned Ruth's house, but both felt the memory. A home had once divided them. Now a small repair placed them on the same side of a task. This was how God's provision arrived, not as enough money to erase need, but as a relationship beginning to breathe again. Samuel's contribution helped pay for temporary nursing support. Aaron organized meals through their church. Claire's sister offered to take Emma after school twice a week. Daniel continued warehouse shifts and job applications. The family did not become independent. They became supported. Daniel had once believed dependence was evidence of failure. Yet the biblical picture of refuge is rarely solitary. A city is sustained by a river. People gather within walls. Songs are sung by communities, not isolated heroes. God's help often moves through human hands. To refuse every hand because it is imperfect may be to refuse part of the answer we have been praying to receive. One afternoon, Daniel met Michael outside the hospital after his father's follow-up appointment. He told him about Samuel. Michael smiled. "You asked God for provision. I did not expect my brother." We usually expect provision to arrive without requiring humility. Daniel laughed quietly. It would have been easier if someone mailed an anonymous check. Perhaps, but then you would have received money and missed your brother. The sentence stayed with Daniel. God's answers often carry more than the immediate thing we requested. We ask for relief, and grace exposes pride. We ask for a door, and grace teaches patience. We ask for strength, and grace gives people who help us admit weakness. The answer can feel inconvenient because God is not only preserving our circumstances, He is restoring our capacity to love. At the warehouse, Louis asked whether Daniel had read the letter. "I did." "And?" "We talked," Louis smiled. "Was anyone completely right?" "No." Terrible outcome. Daniel laughed for the first time that day. "Thank you." Louis shrugged. "I gave you half a sandwich and unwanted advice. This is how friendships begin. Several weeks later, Daniel received an invitation to interview with a community development organization called Harbour House. The position involved coordinating housing assistance, employment support, and partnerships with local churches and charities. The salary was lower than his previous job and far below Victor's offer, yet the work stirred something in him. During the first interview, the director asked why he wanted the role. Daniel began with professional language, then stopped. "Because I know what it feels like when one bad week threatens to become your identity," he said. "And because help matters most when it allows people to keep their dignity." The director studied him. "That answer sounds personal." "It is." Daniel described losing his job, though not every detail. He spoke about receiving groceries, navigating medical care, and discovering how difficult it was to ask for support. The director asked whether he believed he could work with families whose fear sometimes made them angry, demanding, or ashamed. Daniel thought of himself beneath the overpass, at the kitchen table, and on the phone with Samuel. "I think I can understand that fear without letting it decide what they are worth." He left the interview without the wild certainty he had felt after the previous one. The position seemed meaningful, but he did not turn it into salvation. He prepared well, he hoped. He also went to his warehouse shift the next morning. The river continued beneath the noise. A week later, Harbour House called to request a final interview. On the same morning, Daniel's father experienced severe dizziness and was taken back to the hospital for evaluation. Joy and fear arrived within 30 minutes of each other. Daniel stood in the hospital corridor, holding one phone that carried possibility, while a nurse opened the door to uncertainty. Months earlier, such a collision would have torn him between extremes. Good news would mean God was near. Bad news would mean God had withdrawn. Now he felt both emotions, without forcing either to interpret the whole day. He called Claire, contacted Harbour House to adjust the interview time, and sat beside his mother. His hands still trembled. Peace did not make him less human. Michael found him near the same window where they had first met. "You're back," he said. "Dad had a setback. They think it may be medication-related." Daniel explained the interview. "That is a full morning." "Yes." Michael stood beside him. "How are you?" Daniel looked at the city. Afraid, hopeful, tired. He almost added, "but okay." Instead, he said, "and not alone." The words did not come from certainty about outcomes. They came from a story Daniel had begun to recognize. God had been present in the hospital, the purple drawing, the difficult conversation, the job he refused, the warehouse lunch, the letter, the repaired railing, and the people who carried pieces of the burden. None of these moments alone proved that everything would resolve. Together, they revealed a refuge that had not left when the circumstances changed. The battle inside Daniel was not completely over. He still wanted control. He still rehearsed possible disasters. He still found satisfaction in being needed. But he no longer believed every battle required him to become a weapon. He could act without attacking, protect without controlling, disagree without destroying, and hope without demanding a guarantee. Before the doctor returned, Daniel opened Psalm 46 on his phone. His eyes moved across the images of conflict brought to an end. He thought of the years with Samuel. God had not erased the past. He had broken the weapon Daniel kept carrying from it. The war ended not when one brother won, but when both laid down the need to win. Then the doctor entered. Daniel rose to hear the news. At nearly the same moment, an email from Harbour House appeared on his screen, confirming the new interview time. 2 doors opened before him, one into a room of medical uncertainty, the other toward a possible new beginning. Daniel took one breath and stepped toward his father's room. The future remained unfinished, scattered, but the storm no longer had the authority to tell him who he must become inside it. The doctor explained that Daniel's father had not suffered another major cardiac event. A new combination of medication had lowered his blood pressure too quickly, causing the dizziness and weakness. He would remain under observation overnight while the treatment plan was adjusted. The news was reassuring, though not simple. His recovery would continue to require attention, patience, and help at home. Daniel listened, wrote notes, and asked questions. His mother exhaled slowly beside him. Months earlier, Daniel would have heard only the danger that remained. Now he could receive the mercy that was present without pretending uncertainty had disappeared. He stepped into the corridor and called Claire. "It isn't another heart attack," he said. "They think it's the medication." Claire let out a breath. "Thank God." Daniel closed his eyes. The phrase did not mean the difficult morning had been an illusion. It meant gratitude could rise inside it. "Yes," he said. "Thank God." Then he told her about the rescheduled interview with Harbour House. "Can you make it?" she asked. "I think so. Samuel is coming to sit with Mum." The sentence still sounded remarkable. Samuel was coming. Not as a guest invited into a finished family, but as a son and brother sharing the unfinished work. When Samuel arrived, he carried an overnight bag, 2 cups of coffee, and the awkward concern of someone still learning where he belonged. He hugged their mother, spoke with the nurse, and asked Daniel to explain the medication changes. Daniel began answering every question in detail, then stopped himself. "The doctor will return at 4, he said. "You can ask him directly. I wrote everything else here." He handed Samuel the notebook. It was a small act, but Daniel felt the old need to manage loosen. Trust sometimes begins with allowing another person to carry information. "Go to your interview," Samuel said. "I've got this." Daniel looked toward their father's door. "Call if anything changes." "I will. And make sure Mum eats." Samuel smiled faintly. "Daniel?" "Right." Daniel placed his hands in his coat pockets. "You've got this." Samuel nodded. "I've got this." Harbour House occupied a renovated brick building near the edge of downtown Howe. The entrance faced a narrow community garden where winter vegetables grew beneath clear covers. Inside, the walls displayed photographs of families moving into apartments, volunteers carrying furniture, and children painting rooms. The lobby did not feel polished, it felt used. A mother sat with two small children near the reception desk. An older man filled out a form slowly. Someone laughed in a back office. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early and stood beneath a framed statement about dignity, stability, and community. The final interview included the executive director, a program manager, and a woman named Renee, who had once received services from the organization and now advised its staff. They asked practical questions about budgets, partnerships, crisis communication, and difficult clients. Daniel answered from his experience. Then Renee leaned forward. "People who come here are often frightened," she said. "Fear can make them miss appointments, hide information, or become angry with the very people trying to help. How would you respond?" Daniel thought of himself refusing groceries, snapping at Claire, turning an interview into salvation, and arguing with Samuel's unopened letter. "I would not assume resistance means they don't want help," he said. "Sometimes help feels dangerous when accepting it requires a person to admit how much has changed. I would set clear expectations, but I would also try to understand what dignity they believe they are losing." Renee watched him closely. "And if they blame you for not fixing everything?" Daniel smiled without amusement. "I would remember that I have blamed God for the same reason." The room became quiet. Daniel wondered whether he had said too much. The executive director folded his hands. "What did you learn from that?" Daniel looked toward the photographs on the wall. "That presence is not the same as control. You can stand with someone, tell the truth, and help with the next step without pretending you can guarantee their future." He paused. "I used to think helping meant becoming indispensable. Now I think good help returns people to their own courage and community." When the interview ended, the director said they would make a decision within several days. Daniel thanked them and walked outside. Cold sunlight covered the garden. He wanted the job deeply. It fit his experience and the person he was becoming. But he did not feel the frantic need to interpret every smile or sentence as proof. He had spoken truthfully. The decision belonged elsewhere. At the hospital, Samuel was sitting beside their father's bed, reading aloud from the sports section of a newspaper. Their father's eyes were closed, but a small smile appeared when Samuel exaggerated a headline. Daniel stopped at the doorway. The sight was ordinary. It was also something he had quietly believed he would never see again. His mother slept in the chair near the window. The notebook rested on Samuel's knee. Daniel entered without announcing himself. "How did it go?" Samuel asked. "Good, I think." Their father opened his eyes. "You think?" "I don't know yet." "Then it went as far as it could go today," the older man said. Daniel laughed. "You've become philosophical." Hospital food does that. They spent the evening together. No one held a formal conversation about reconciliation. Samuel adjusted their father's blanket. Daniel filled a water cup. Their mother woke and insisted everyone eat. At one point, the brothers disagreed about whether their parents should hire more home support. The old tone began to return. Daniel heard himself speaking faster. Samuel crossed his arms. Then Daniel stopped. "I'm trying to control this," he said. Samuel blinked. A little. And you're acting as though concern is criticism. Also a little. Their father looked between them. This may be the healthiest argument you've ever had. They laughed, and the tension lost its authority. The disagreement remained. They decided to speak with the nurse and their parents before making a plan. Peace did not require identical opinions. It required that love become more important than victory. The next morning, Daniel returned to the warehouse. Luis was labeling damaged boxes near the loading area. "How is your father?" he asked. Daniel explained the medication issue and the interview. "Sounds like life gave you fear and hope in the same package," Luis said. "It has stopped separating them for my convenience." Luis nodded. Very inconsiderate. During their break, Daniel asked how Luis had reconciled with his sister. Luis looked at the orange in his hand. "We started with a phone call. Then we had to forgive each other again every time we remembered another reason not to." Again. Forgiveness is often a decision with many echoes. He separated the peel carefully. People imagine one emotional moment. Sometimes it is that. More often, the heart returns to the old courtroom, and you choose not to reopen the trial. Daniel understood since speaking with Samuel, memories had returned at unexpected times. A comment about money, an empty chair at Christmas, their mother's tears. Each memory invited him to rebuild the old case. Forgiveness did not ask him to call harm harmless. It asked him not to keep feeding his identity with accusation. The battle could end, even while scars remained. That evening, Daniel received a call from Harbour House. The executive director offered him the position. The salary was exactly as advertised, modest but sufficient if the family continued living carefully. The organization would provide health coverage after 30 days. They wanted him to begin in 2 weeks. Daniel stood in the hallway, listening to the words. Relief rose, but it was different from the rush he had felt after Victor's offer. This relief did not require him to silence his conscience. It did not promise to restore every part of his old life. It opened a new path rather than returning him to the mountain that had fallen. He thanked the director and asked for the written offer. After ending the call, he went to the kitchen. Claire was helping Emma with fractions. Daniel leaned against the doorway. "They offered me the job." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Emma jumped from the chair. "The helping people job." "The helping people job." She ran into him, and he lifted her from the floor. Claire stood and wrapped her arms around both of them. For a moment, Daniel felt pure happiness. Then another thought appeared. The salary, the waiting period for insurance, the possibility that he might fail. The old anxiety tried to enter the celebration. Daniel noticed it and let it pass without obeying. "We still need to look at the details," he said. Claire nodded. "Tomorrow." She touched his face. "Tonight, we can be grateful." They ordered inexpensive pizza and called Daniel's parents. Samuel answered from their home, where he was helping install a pill organizer with alarms. When Daniel shared the news, his father said, "I knew someone would recognize your value." Daniel smiled. "They offered me work. That isn't the same as giving me value." The words surprised him. A few months earlier, he could not have separated the two. After dinner, Emma asked whether the job meant everything was fixed. Daniel sat beside her on the couch. "It helps a lot," he said, "but life is not a machine where one new part fixes every other part. Grandpa still needs care. We still need to be wise with money. You may still feel scared sometimes." Emma frowned. "That doesn't sound like a happy ending." Daniel smiled. "Maybe a happy ending is not when nothing hard can happen. Maybe it is when we know hard things are not the only things that are true." Emma considered this. Like the river under the loud water? Daniel stared at her. He had told her about the two kinds of water in the psalm a few nights earlier. Exactly like that. The weeks before Daniel began the job were filled with transitions. He completed his warehouse assignment and thanked Luis, who insisted Daniel take a final sandwich. "For management meetings," Luis said. "Never trust a meeting without food." Daniel promised to stay in touch. The staffing supervisor shook his hand and told him he had worked with unusual care. Daniel had assumed the warehouse weeks were a humiliating detour. Instead, they had become part of his formation. Honest work had separated dignity from status. Luis had become a friend. A place Daniel wanted to escape had given him something he needed to carry forward. His father returned home again with adjusted medication. Recovery progressed unevenly. Some mornings he walked to the end of the driveway. Other days he could barely cross the living room. Daniel learned not to treat a bad day as the destruction of every good one. Samuel began calling twice a week and visiting when possible. Their conversations remained cautious but increasingly natural. The family created a shared schedule for appointments and expenses. Daniel no longer carried every detail alone. At Harbour House, his first week confronted him with stories more difficult than his own. A woman and her son had been sleeping in their car after an eviction. An older man lost work while caring for his wife. A young father arrived angry because an assistance payment had been delayed. Daniel felt the temptation to prove competence by solving everything quickly. But systems moved slowly. Resources were limited. People missed calls. Forms disappeared. Need was larger than any one organization. One afternoon, the young father struck the desk with his palm and accused Daniel of not caring whether his children had heat. Daniel's body tightened. His first instinct was to defend the process. Then he saw the man's hands shaking. He remembered the overpass, the steering wheel, and the fear that made every delay feel like abandonment. "I hear that you are afraid for your children," Daniel said, "and you have a right to expect us to be honest. I cannot promise the payment today. I can tell you what I can do before you leave." The man remained angry, but his voice lowered. Daniel called two partner organizations, arranged temporary utility credit, and scheduled a follow-up. It was not a complete solution. It was presence, truth, and the next step. As the man left, he turned and said, "I'm sorry I yelled." Daniel answered, "You were carrying a lot." Afterward, Daniel sat alone at his desk and recognized the shape of grace. God had not wasted his season of helplessness. The pain did not become good simply because something useful grew from it, but it had deepened Daniel's ability to remain near another person's fear without judging it. This is often how divine provision works. We ask for rescue from an experience, and later discover that God also intends to redeem what the experience formed in us. Redemption is not the claim that suffering was secretly harmless. It is the refusal to let suffering have the final ownership of our story. Daniel's job loss had wounded his confidence and frightened his family. It had also exposed the false foundation beneath his identity, restored his relationship with Samuel, opened him to community, and led him toward work where his weakness became a source of compassion. Months earlier, Daniel would have called the new job the miracle. Now he saw a wider pattern. The miracle, if that word could be used, was not a single event large enough to explain everything. It was a chain of quiet provisions. Michael's coffee, Emma's drawing, Claire's truth, Aaron's groceries, the warehouse shift, Louise's sandwich, Samuel's letter, a repaired railing, medical care, a smaller salary, and courage, arriving one decision at a time. God's presence had not been hidden because it was absent. It had been hidden because Daniel expected it to look only like control. One evening, Michael visited Harbour House for a meeting about hospital discharge support. He found Daniel stacking chairs afterward. "This suits you," Michael said. Daniel looked around the multi-purpose room. "It's messier than my old office." So are most human lives. They carried chairs together. Daniel told him about the new work, Samuel, and his father's slow recovery. "I used to think God would prove he was with me by putting everything back," Daniel said. "Now, I'm not sure going back would have been the same as being restored." Michael set down a chair. "Restoration is not always replacement. What is it then?" "Sometimes it is receiving a life that is more truthful than the one you lost." Daniel considered the sentence. His old life had looked stable, but much of its stability depended on silence, performance, and the belief that he could keep every mountain in place. The new life was financially smaller and emotionally less protected, yet it contained more honesty, relationship, and awareness of grace. That night, Daniel drove home along the river. City lights moved across the dark water. The river did not appear powerful from the road, it simply continued. Rain had fed it, stones redirected it, bridges crossed it. Yet it moved toward the sea without asking the city to become quiet. When Daniel entered the house, he found Emma asleep on the couch, a school book open on her chest. Claire sat nearby with a blanket over her legs. She looked tired. "Long day?" he asked. "Very." He sat beside her. No crisis demanded an answer. No dramatic music entered the room. Daniel took her hand. The peace he felt was not the confidence that nothing would go wrong tomorrow. It was the freedom of no longer needing that promise in order to be present tonight. Then Claire told him his father had called. The latest test showed an issue that would require another procedure. It was not an emergency, but it carried risk. The old fear moved through Daniel immediately. He felt it in his stomach and shoulders. For one moment, the new job, the reconciled brother, and every hopeful development seemed fragile. Claire watched his face. "Are you okay?" Daniel did not say yes. He did not say no. He took one breath. "I'm scared," he said. "But fear does not get to decide what this moment means." Claire leaned against him. Life had not become simple. Joy and uncertainty still arrived together. Daniel had not graduated from the need to trust. He was learning that peace was not a permanent feeling stored inside him. It was a place to which he returned, the refuge of a God who did not leave when the next call came. In the days ahead, Daniel would face his father's procedure, the demands of new work, Emma's lingering anxiety, and the ordinary strain of rebuilding a life. But the final lesson of Psalm 46 was becoming clear. Be still was not a doorway out of reality. It was a way of standing inside reality without allowing its loudest moment to become its deepest truth. Several months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Daniel would return to the small church his grandmother once attended. Sunlight would move across the same wooden floor where he had wrestled with Victor's offer. He would sit in the back row and recognize, one by one, the places where God had been present before Daniel knew how to see him. And there, beneath the silence, the ancient words would no longer sound like a command spoken from a distance. They would sound like an invitation from the one who had remained in every room. Be still. Not because the storm is over. Be still because I am God, and you have never been outside my care. Several months later, winter loosened its hold on the city. Snow remained in the shadows of buildings, but water ran along the curbs, and the first green shoots appeared in the community garden outside Harbour House. Daniel had learned the names of nearly everyone who came through the doors. He knew which families needed an interpreter, which elderly clients required larger print, and which children reached immediately for the jar of crayons near the reception desk. His office was small. The radiator knocked whenever it turned on. A crack crossed one corner of the window. On the wall above his desk hung Emma's purple drawing. 4 people holding hands beneath an enormous yellow sun, with the uneven words, "God is here." The picture had become more honest with time. When Emma first drew it, Daniel assumed faith meant believing God would keep the family from losing what mattered. Now he saw that the drawing said something deeper. The people were not standing beneath a roof, a paycheck, or a guarantee. They were standing together beneath a presence larger than the page. God is here. Not only when Grandpa is strong, not only when Dad has work, not only when fear is gone. Here, life had settled into new rhythms, but it had not become easy. Daniel's father underwent the procedure and recovered without major complications, yet his strength returned slowly. Some days he was cheerful and determined. Other days frustration made him sharp with everyone who tried to help. Daniel's mother grew tired from caregiving and resisted admitting it. Samuel visited more often, though old habits still surfaced. He sometimes disappeared into work when conversations became emotional. Daniel sometimes corrected him before listening. Reconciliation remained a living practice rather than a completed achievement. At home, finances were stable but careful. Claire continued several extra shifts, and Daniel's salary required choices the family once avoided. They repaired the car instead of replacing it. They postponed travel. They learned which meals could stretch across 2 evenings. None of these sacrifices made them spiritually superior. Sometimes they were simply inconvenient. Yet the family spoke more openly about money. Emma knew enough to feel included without being made responsible for adult burdens. When she became anxious, she practiced breathing with Claire and named what she feared. Some nights the fear passed quickly. Other nights, Daniel sat beside her bed until she slept. One evening, after an especially difficult day at Harbour House, Daniel returned home carrying the weight of several families he could not fully help. A rental assistance fund had run out. A mother had been told no apartment would accept her application. An older client's illness had worsened. Daniel entered the kitchen and found Claire reading at the table. She looked up. "You're somewhere else." He set down his bag. "There are too many needs. And you tried to carry all of them home?" Daniel gave a tired smile. "Apparently." Claire closed the book. "Sit." Months earlier, he might have defended his dedication. Now he recognized the old pattern. Responsibility had begun turning into control again. He sat. Claire placed both hands around his. "What belongs to you tonight?" she asked. Daniel thought of the question. "I need to follow up with 2 partner organizations tomorrow. I need to prepare for the housing meeting." "What does not belong to you tonight?" "Guaranteeing that everyone gets what they need?" The answer hurt. Claire nodded. "Then let God be God while you eat dinner." Stillness had become less dramatic and more necessary. It was not a lesson Daniel completed during the crisis. It was a practice he returned to whenever fear tempted him to become sovereign again. Some mornings he sat quietly for 10 minutes. Other days, stillness was one breath before answering an angry client. Sometimes it was turning off his phone at dinner. Sometimes it was apologizing before building a defense. Sometimes it was allowing Samuel to make a decision differently. Sometimes it was sleeping while a problem remained unsolved. The words, "be still," no longer sounded like an order to create a peaceful atmosphere. They sounded like a release from the exhausting belief that everything depended on Daniel's vigilance. The psalm did not ask the earth to stop shaking before naming God as refuge. It did not require the waters to become calm before declaring his presence. It did not wait for the nations to agree before announcing that God would be exalted. The confidence of Psalm 46 rests not in a predictable world, but in an unchanging God. This matters because most of us postpone peace. We tell ourselves we will breathe after the diagnosis, after the debt is paid, after the child is safe, after the relationship is repaired, after the answer arrives. We place stillness on the far side of control. But the far side keeps moving. One problem resolves and another appears. One prayer is answered and a new question rises. A life built on the condition that nothing uncertain may remain will never become peaceful. Electron. Daniel had spent years believing peace was the reward for managing life correctly. The crisis exposed the impossibility of that arrangement. No amount of discipline could prevent every loss. No plan could hold each mountain in place. No human love could promise that the people we cherish would never suffer. This realization could have led to despair. Instead, Psalm 46 offered another foundation. Because control was never Daniel's source of safety, losing control did not mean losing God. On a Sunday morning in early spring, Daniel drove alone to the church his grandmother had attended. The small brick building stood between an apartment complex and an old grocery store. Its sign needed paint. The steps were uneven. Daniel had visited once during the crisis, when Victor's offer forced him to choose between quick security and a troubled conscience. That day, the sanctuary had felt like a place of conflict. Now, sunlight poured through the coloured windows and rested in blue, red, and gold shapes across the wooden floor. He arrived before the service and sat in the back row. The room smelled faintly of dust, furniture polish, and coffee from the fellowship hall. An elderly woman arranged hymn books. A young father carried a sleeping child toward the nursery. Two teenagers whispered near the side door. Nothing about the scene was spectacular, yet Daniel felt the quiet weight of memory. His grandmother had sat somewhere in this room for decades. She had prayed through storms Daniel never fully knew. His grandfather's illness, financial hardship, loneliness, and the fear of raising children in a world she could not control. He took the wooden cross from his pocket. The edge had become smoother during the months he carried it. Daniel remembered the childhood thunderstorm and her words. God is not only present after the storm, He is already present inside it. For years he had treated the sentence as comforting poetry. Now each word held a place and a face. God had been present in conference room B when Daniel's name appeared on the folder. Not because losing work was good, but because Daniel's worth did not leave with the position. God had been present in the grocery store where Daniel delayed telling Claire, patiently waiting beneath the fear he could not name. God had been present in the hospital restroom when Daniel whispered, "I can't do this," and discovered that confession did not destroy him. God had been present beneath the overpass when anger struck the steering wheel and prayer became honest. God had been present in Michael's coffee and his refusal to explain pain away. In Daniel's father admitting that adults rarely know what they are doing. In the nurse who wrote medication instructions slowly. In Aaron carrying groceries through the door. In Claire saying she was afraid too. In Emma's purple crayon. In the quiet river Daniel had missed for years. God had been present when stillness uncovered anger. In the job interview that ended with rejection. In the email from Victor that revealed the difference between provision and escape. In the empty sanctuary where Daniel wanted a choice without risk. In Claire's words, "I do not need you to control the future. I need you to be here." In the phone call where Daniel said no and discovered fear could remain present without being obeyed. God had been present in the unopened letter from Samuel. in Lewis's unwanted advice and half a sandwich, in the painful phone call where two brothers gave up the right to be completely innocent, in their father's invitation to come home, in the railing they repaired together, in the grief for years lost, and the grace that arrived late, but not too late. God had been present in the warehouse, in work Daniel had considered beneath him, in the community garden outside Harbour House, in the angry father whose shaking hands revealed fear, in a salary smaller than Daniel once believed necessary, in a procedure that succeeded without making his father young again, in ordinary medicine, tired caregivers, shared calendars, and the humility of asking for help. The recognition did not make Daniel believe every event had been planned as a lesson for him. He refused to call suffering good merely because goodness had met him there. His father's illness was painful. Emma's anxiety mattered. The job loss wounded the family. Electro moan, the estrangement with Samuel had wasted years. Faith did not require Daniel to decorate grief with easy explanations. It invited him to see that grief had never occupied the room alone. A musician began playing softly at the front of the sanctuary. Daniel remained seated while people entered. He opened the Bible resting in the pew and turned to Psalm 46. The page was not his grandmother's, but he could imagine her thin pencil line beneath the words. He read the psalm slowly, no longer as a promise that faithful people would avoid disaster. It was a song for people who had seen the mountains move and discovered that God remained. The earth can change. A job can end terribly. A body can weaken. A relationship can fracture. A child can become afraid. A plan can fail. Waters can roar through the mind until sleep becomes difficult, and every tomorrow carries danger. Nations can rage, systems can shake, and the news can make the world feel unstable. Psalm 46 looks directly at such realities and refuses to give them the final name. Over them, beneath them, and within the lives of those who endure them is the presence of God. Daniel paused at the line about the river. In ancient imagination, a river meant life, stability, and provision. It watered what walls alone could not preserve. The city was glad, not because enemies never approached, but because a source of life flowed within it. Daniel thought of grace as that river, not always visible from the place where fear stood, but steady. It had flowed through his family, church, hospital, workplace, and strangers. It had moved around stones. It had found paths through hard ground, and then his eyes reached the words that had followed him. Be still, and know that I am God. He understood now why the command appeared after so much chaos. Stillness mattered precisely because the world was loud. It was not an escape from action, grief, or responsibility. It was the holy interruption of panic's claim to ultimate authority. Be still. Release the weapon. Stop using control as salvation. Let the heart remember what fear keeps forgetting. God is God. To know this is not to understand every decision God makes. Daniel still had questions. Why did some families receive help while others waited? Why did his father recover when another patient down the hall had not? Why did reconciliation come with Samuel after 6 years, while some relationships remained closed despite prayer? Knowing God did not mean possessing an explanation for every mystery. It meant trusting his character when explanation remained incomplete. The service began. The congregation stood, and Daniel stood with them. He did not feel an overwhelming spiritual sensation. He felt gratitude, grief, and peace braided together. Perhaps that was more durable than excitement. Sang quietly, remembering the man who had sat beneath the overpass, believing God had disappeared. He wished he could return to that car and tell himself what he now knew. But then he realized the man in the car had not needed a future version of Daniel with answers. He had needed the God who was already there. After the service, an elderly woman approached. She had watched Daniel holding the wooden cross. "Ruth Carter had one like that," she said. Daniel smiled. This was hers. The woman's face brightened. "You must be Danny." He had not been called that in years. "She prayed for you every Wednesday," the woman said, "even after you were grown. She would sit in the second row and say, 'My grandson thinks he has to carry the whole world. The Lord will teach him that he doesn't.'" Daniel laughed, then covered his mouth as tears rose. "She said that?" More than once. The woman touched his arm. "She loved you very much." Daniel looked toward the second row. His grandmother had known the shape of his struggle long before he did. Her prayers had not prevented the crisis. Perhaps they had prepared a path through it. Outside the church, sunlight warmed the steps. Daniel called Claire and told her what the woman had said. Claire laughed. "Your grandmother understood you." "Apparently everyone did, except me. You were busy carrying the world." Daniel looked toward the traffic. "I'm trying to put it down." Claire's voice softened. "Come home. Your dad and Samuel are already here. Emma is making pancakes, and the kitchen may not survive." When Daniel arrived, flour covered the counter. Emma wore an apron over her pajamas. Samuel stood near the stove, pretending to understand the pan. Daniel's father sat at the table with his cane beside him, criticizing everyone's technique. His mother laughed from the doorway. Claire handed Daniel a cup of coffee. The room was loud, imperfect, and alive. Daniel stopped near the entrance. For one moment, he saw both the fragility and beauty of the scene. His father would not always sit at that table. Samuel and he would disagree again. Emma would face fears Daniel could not remove. Claire and Daniel would have tired days. Work would bring new burdens. Love did not freeze the mountains in place. It made the present worth receiving, even while change remained inevitable. "Are you going to help?" Emma asked. Daniel placed the wooden cross on the windowsill and rolled up his sleeves. "What needs to be done?" "Everything," Samuel said, holding up a burned pancake. The family laughed. Daniel stepped into the room. Perhaps your life feels like Daniel's did beneath the overpass. Perhaps the news came too quickly and your mind has not caught up. Perhaps you are waiting for medical results, grieving a person or a future, facing financial pressure, carrying conflict inside your family, or wondering why prayer has not changed what hurts. You may believe stillness belongs to people whose lives are easier. You may hear "be still" as one more demand to stop feeling what you feel. But Psalm 46 does not shame the frightened heart. It gives the frightened heart somewhere to stand. It says the storm is real, but it is not God. The shaking is powerful, but it is not ultimate. Your feelings deserve honesty, but they do not possess complete knowledge of your future. Fear may speak loudly, yet fear is not the voice that holds the world. You do not have to pretend the mountain is stable. You do not have to call loss a blessing before you are ready. You do not have to solve every question tonight. Stillness begins with one truthful breath before God. I am afraid, corrupt. I am angry. I am tired. I do not know what to do. Such prayers are not failures of faith. They are doors opened from the inside. Then, perhaps, name the burden you have been carrying as though everything depends on you. The person you cannot heal. The decision you cannot guarantee. The relationship you cannot force open. The future you cannot arrange. The mistake you cannot undo. Place it before God, not because it no longer matters, but because it matters too much to be held by human strength alone. Be still does not mean do nothing. Make the call, attend the appointment, scatterize, set the boundary, submit the application, ask for help, take the medication, speak the truth, rest when you can, do the next faithful thing. But do not ask that action to become your God. Your obedience is yours. The outcome is not. Look also for the river Mer. It may not arrive as the miracle you imagined. It may be a friend who listens, a meal, a counselor, a nurse, a verse remembered at the right hour, an unexpected apology, honest work, a child's drawing, or strength sufficient for today, but not yet for next month. Do not despise small mercies, because they are not the entire answer. Rivers are made of water that keeps arriving. God's presence is not measured by the intensity of what you feel. There will be days when faith feels warm and days when prayer feels empty. There will be mornings when hope rises easily and nights when you repeat one sentence because it is all you have. The refuge does not become weaker because your awareness changes. God does not leave the room when your emotions cannot find him. The deepest comfort of Psalm 46 is not that nothing will change. Everything in human life changes. The deepest comfort is that change cannot remove you from the presence of God. The earth may move beneath your feet, but you are not falling beyond his reach. Waters may rise, but they cannot erase his knowledge of your name. The world may become unfamiliar, but God does not become uncertain about you. Daniel once believed he would be still when his life returned to his control. Instead, he learned to be still because his life had never rested in his control. It rested in grace. That grace did not always prevent pain. It met him within pain, told the truth, supplied the next step, and refused to let fear become the author of his character. So breathe. Not because every answer has arrived. Breathe because God is already present before the next answer comes. Pray. Not because you can force heaven to follow your plan. Pray because you are invited to bring your whole heart into the care of the one who knows it. Rest. Not because no danger exists. Rest because vigilance is not what keeps the universe from falling apart. The mountains may still tremble tomorrow. The river will still flow. The phone may ring with news you did not expect. God will not be surprised. You may discover strength you did not know you possessed, but even that strength will not be the foundation. The foundation will be the same truth that held Daniel in every room and has held generations of frightened hearts before him. God is our refuge. God is our strength. God is near. And when life feels out of control, remember this. Stillness is not the moment you finally manage everything. Stillness is the moment you release what was never yours to rule and discover that you are still held. Be still. Not because the storm has ended, not because the mountain has stopped moving, and not because tomorrow has become certain. Be still, because even here, even now, God is still God. God is still near, and His faithful hands have not loosened their hold on you.